Many landscapes quietly surrendered their stories beneath modern streets and restless generations, yet a few still retained an older memory. Before bridges crossed every horizon and before engines replaced the patient rhythm of paddle wheels, the broad valley where the Mississippi embraced the Missouri possessed a silence unlike any other in the American interior. Morning mist lingered above the water until the first rays of sunlight reached the limestone bluffs. Cottonwoods stirred gently along the banks, their leaves answering a breeze that had traveled unhindered across forests, prairies, and distant settlements. Long before the day's commerce awakened, the rivers themselves had already begun their ancient conversation, carrying driftwood, reflections of passing clouds, and the quiet labor of countless lives toward the Gulf, far beyond the southern horizon. Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight we turn the pages of history back to 19th Century Street, Lewis County, Missouri, where riverboats moved beneath towering bluffs long before the Great Steel Arch became the city's familiar emblem. Here, every current carried more than water. It bore emigrants seeking new farms, merchants pursuing distant markets, missionaries traveling to scattered congregations, craftsmen searching for opportunity, and families whose names would quietly become woven into the county's enduring story. Throughout the coming hours we shall walk neither hurriedly nor with great ceremony, but with the measured pace of one who allowed the county itself to reveal its character through fields, villages, churches, ferries, orchards, workshops, and the broad rivers that patiently united them all. The geography bestowed upon this county a distinction enjoyed by remarkably few places upon the continent. Along its eastern boundary flowed the mighty Mississippi, already celebrated by travelers as one of the world's great waterways. Approaching from the northwest came the equally formidable Missouri River, descending after an immense journey across plains and distant mountain country before surrendering its waters to the larger stream near the county's northern reaches. Their meeting formed not merely a geographical curiosity, but a living crossroads where commerce, migration, agriculture, and culture quietly converged throughout the 19th century. Even those who never ventured far from their own farms understood that these waters connected their modest homes with New Orleans to the south, Pittsburgh to the east through connecting rivers, and an expanding western frontier beyond imagination. The county itself unfolded as a succession of remarkably varied landscapes. Limestone bluffs overlooked the Mississippi with quiet authority, their pale faces catching the first and last light of every day. Gentle uplands stretched westward into fertile farms whose deep soils rewarded careful cultivation. Between those higher ridges wandered numerous creeks that patiently carved wooded valleys where sycamores, walnut, elm, and oak flourished in generous abundance. During spring, the forest floor brightened with delicate wildflowers. Summer clothed every hillside in dense foliage, that softened even the oldest wagon roads. Autumn transformed the bluffs into glowing galleries of amber and russet, while winter revealed the enduring architecture of stone, timber, and river beneath clear skies of remarkable stillness. For those approaching by water, the county announced itself long before individual settlements became visible. A faint ribbon of blue smoke rose above wooded shores, where homes prepared the morning meal. Church steeples gradually emerged above groves of mature trees. Here and there, the steady knocking of a distant mill echoed across calm water, before vanishing again beneath the calls of waterfowl drifting along quiet backwaters. Soon the tall chimneys of riverboats appeared around broad bends, followed by the rhythmic turning of immense paddle wheels, whose measured cadence became one of the defining sounds of 19th century life throughout this remarkable valley. The rivers alone never explained the county. Their waters carried opportunity to its shores, yet it was the land rising beyond them that persuaded families to remain. Travelers who climbed from the busy landings toward the higher ground discovered a countryside remarkably different from the crowded levees below. Broad ridges unfolded gently across the landscape, interrupted by fertile creek valleys where clear streams turned mill wheels before quietly continuing toward the Mississippi. Wagon roads followed these natural contours with practical wisdom learned through generations rather than engineering. In dry weather, they carried farmers, ministers, teachers, and merchants with reassuring steadiness. During spring rains, they became ribbons of deep clay where every journey required patience from both horse and driver. Among the oldest and most enduring roads was Bellefontaine Road, whose course had long connected settlements north of St. Louis with the surrounding countryside. Manchester Road stretched westward toward the interior, while Gravois Road followed an ancient route first known to native peoples and later adopted by French traders before American settlement steadily increased. None possessed the smooth appearance expected of later generations. Their surfaces bore the marks of wagon wheels, livestock, countless hoofprints, and the gradual labor of county road crews who repaired bridges, cleared fallen timber, and spread fresh stone wherever the earth surrendered beneath heavy traffic. Every mile reflected continual use rather than careful design, and therein rested much of their quiet character. Near these familiar roads, scattered settlements gradually acquired identities entirely their own. Florissant, whose history reached back to the French colonial era, remained one of the county's oldest communities. Its stone houses, shaded gardens, and Catholic traditions quietly preserved memories extending far beyond the 19th century. Carondelet, lying beside the Mississippi to the south, combined river commerce with modest industries whose workshops echoed throughout the working day. Manchester stood farther inland, where farms, inns, and stores welcomed travelers moving steadily westward. Between these established villages, appeared smaller crossroads containing little more than a blacksmith's forge, a general store, a post office, and perhaps a church whose bell united surrounding families each Sabbath morning. Although every settlement differed in size, each remained connected by the same enduring landscape. Orchards flourished wherever gentle slopes received generous sunlight. Apple trees, peach trees, pear trees, and cherry trees transformed spring into a season of fragrant blossoms whose pale petals drifted across nearby fences and wagon paths. By autumn, those same branches bent beneath abundant fruit, destined for fresh tables, cider presses, drying racks, and carefully arranged cellar shelves that sustained households throughout the colder months. Even travelers passing quickly through the county often remarked upon the remarkable beauty of these orchards as they softened the transition between cultivated fields and surrounding woodland. The county's forests remained no less important than its orchards. Oak, walnut, hickory, elm, sycamore, maple, and ash supplied timber for homes, barns, furniture, wagons, bridges, fences, cooperage, and countless tools required by daily life. Winter became the preferred season for felling mature trees, when frozen ground better supported heavy wagons, and sap rested quietly within the trunks. The ringing rhythm of axes echoed through woodland hollows, while teams of horses patiently dragged great logs toward nearby sawmills. Their labor altered the landscape gradually rather than suddenly. Even as farms expanded, generous woodlots continued surrounding many homesteads, providing fuel, building materials, shade, wildlife, and a comforting sense of permanence that distinguished much of Street Louis County throughout the century. Water remained a constant companion even for those whose homes stood many miles from the Mississippi. Cold springs emerged from limestone hillsides with remarkable clarity, feeding creeks that seldom ceased their patient movement. Along these waterways, millers constructed sturdy dams, whose gentle pools reflected forests above, while wooden water wheels turned steadily from dawn until evening. The mills became more than places where grain was transformed into flour. They served as gathering places where neighbors exchanged news while waiting their turn. Children explored nearby banks in search of smooth stones and curious shells, and horses rested comfortably beneath spreading sycamores. Flour dust drifted softly through shafts of afternoon light, settling upon worn timber floors that had supported generations of quiet industry. At sunrise, mist often lingered above these narrow streams, long after the higher fields had welcomed full daylight. Kingfishers darted low across the water. Herons waited motionless among reeds, while the occasional splash of a turtle disturbed reflections that otherwise remained undisturbed. Such scenes seldom entered official county reports, yet they formed part of the everyday landscape known intimately by millers, fishermen, farmers, and children alike. The county revealed itself not only through commerce and settlement, but through these quieter corners where nature and labor continued side by side with little interruption. The earliest inhabitants understood these waters long before county boundaries had been surveyed or roads carefully measured upon official maps. Native peoples traveled the rivers, hunted among the oak-covered ridges, and gathered along fertile floodplains where fish, game, and rich soils provided generous sustenance through changing seasons. By the time French explorers and missionaries entered the Mississippi Valley during the 17th century, many ancient paths already connected the bluffs, river crossings, and interior streams. Those trails, established through centuries of practical experience, later guided traders, settlers, and road builders alike. Thus, even as the 19th century advanced with increasing confidence, the county quietly retained landscapes whose history reached far deeper than its newest communities. French influence remained visible throughout much of the county, long after sovereignty had changed. Place names preserved the language of the earliest colonial settlements, while thick-walled stone houses reflected building traditions carried from the villages of New France. Along shaded lanes, one occasionally encountered dwellings constructed from carefully laid limestone or heavy timber, their broad porches overlooking gardens enclosed by simple wooden fences. Grapevines climbed weathered trellises beside kitchen gardens where herbs, beans, onions, cabbages, and medicinal plants flourished together. The gentle ringing of Catholic church bells drifting across these older settlements recalled a chapter of local history that had begun generations before the 19th century itself. American migration gradually introduced new customs, without entirely erasing those already established. Families arriving from Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Ohio, and the eastern seaboard brought different architectural styles, farming methods, religious traditions, and accents. Yet the landscape encouraged cooperation more readily than division. Barns rose beside older French farmsteads. End quote. English gradually became more common within schools and markets, while French continued to be spoken among many long-established households. German immigrants, whose numbers steadily increased during the middle decades of the century, added further richness to the county's character through skilled craftsmanship, productive farms, breweries, gardens, schools, and churches. Rather than replacing one another, these traditions quietly settled beside the same rivers, roads, and fertile fields, creating a community whose identity became remarkably varied, yet unmistakably local. Morning markets reflected this diversity with quiet elegance. Farmers arrived before sunrise, their wagons laden with butter packed in cool crocks, eggs nestled carefully within straw, fresh vegetables still carrying dew from nearby gardens, orchard fruit arranged in neat baskets, smoked meats, cheeses, honey, flour, and woven goods produced during the previous winter. German bakers displayed dark loaves fragrant with rye, while French families offered pastries prepared according to recipes preserved across generations. Merchants greeted familiar customers by name rather than haste, and conversation often lingered longer than the exchange of coins. News of river conditions, approaching weather, church socials, harvest prospects, or relatives recently arrived by steamboat passed quietly from one household to another beneath canvas awnings that sheltered both goods and neighbors from the summer sun. As the sun gradually descended behind the western ridges, long shadows stretched across orchards and harvested fields, while the county settled into its familiar evening rhythm. Smoke curled gently from farmhouse chimneys. Horses returned unhurriedly toward waiting barns after the day's labor. Along distant roads, isolated wagons continued homeward beneath towering oaks whose branches filtered the fading light into warm bands of gold. Far below the limestone bluffs, another packet steamboat rounded a broad bend of the Mississippi, its paddle wheels beating steadily against the current as its whistle echoed softly through the valley. The sound traveled across woodland, meadow, churchyard, and village alike before slowly dissolving into the evening air, reminding every listener that the great river never truly rested. Thus began our quiet walk through 19th Century Street. Louis County, not with famous names or dramatic events, but with the enduring companionship of rivers, roads, orchards, forests, villages, and ordinary people whose daily labors gave lasting meaning to the landscape. In the chapters that followed, we would leave these broad views behind and step more closely into the river landings themselves, where steamboats transformed peaceful shorelines into places of patient industry, hopeful arrivals, and countless departures beneath the watchful limestone bluffs. The first light of morning seldom found the Mississippi asleep. Before the rooftops of nearby settlements reflected the rising sun, movement had already begun upon the broad water. Thin columns of smoke climbed quietly from steamboat chimneys, while deckhands crossed damp planks, carrying coils of rope that had grown heavy with river mist. The slow churning of paddle wheels echoed against the limestone bluffs with a rhythm so familiar that many county residents scarcely noticed it. Yet for newcomers arriving from distant states, those measured sounds announced entry into one of the busiest inland river regions in North America. Throughout much of the 19th century, the Mississippi served as the county's greatest thoroughfare. Long before railways reached every corner of Missouri, nearly every object too heavy for ordinary wagons found passage upon its waters. Flour milled from nearby grain, barrels of pork, tobacco packed carefully into hogsheads, walnut lumber, limestone, livestock, orchard produce, manufactured goods, newspapers, books, furniture, cast iron stoves, agricultural machinery, and countless everyday necessities moved steadily through the river landings. The current itself appeared almost alive with commerce, carrying vessels northward and southward in a procession that changed with the seasons, yet rarely ceased altogether. For the people living upon farms overlooking the valley, the appearance of each arriving steamboat carried quiet significance. Families often paused from their labor when a distant whistle drifted across the fields. Children hurried toward elevated hillsides from which they could glimpse the broad river below. Farmers leaned upon split-rail fences for a moment before returning to their work, recognizing many vessels by the shape of their tall chimneys or the distinctive arrangement of their paddle guards. Merchants anticipated fresh cargo, while travelers wondered whether relatives from distant counties might soon step ashore carrying trunks dusted by long journeys. Approaching one of the county's active landings revealed an orderly confusion that possessed its own quiet rhythm. Freight wagons arrived one after another, their wooden wheels creaking beneath remarkable loads. Teamsters guided patient horses toward warehouses whose wide doors stood open from early morning until evening. Warehouse clerks consulted ledgers with practiced care, carefully recording every shipment before laborers rolled barrels across stout timber planks leading toward waiting vessels. Iron hooks, block and tackle cranes, hand carts, and broad loading ramps performed their work without unnecessary haste. Each movement reflected experience acquired through years spent beside the river rather than hurried efficiency alone. Passengers contributed another layer to the gentle bustle of the levee. Ladies, carrying neatly folded parasols, stepped carefully across gangplanks with assistance from attentive crewmen. Gentlemen in broad-brimmed hats paused to observe the activity before boarding. Children clutched small satchels while gazing in quiet amazement at the immense paddle wheels towering above the waterline. Ministers traveled toward distant congregations. School teachers returned after visiting relatives. Merchants departed for commercial houses farther south, while immigrants newly arrived from eastern cities prepared to begin unfamiliar lives upon Missouri farms. Every departure suggested another arrival somewhere beyond the next bend of the river. Riverboat captains occupied positions of considerable respect throughout the valley. Their knowledge extended far beyond navigation alone. They recognized changing currents, shifting sandbars, submerged snags, seasonal floods, hidden landings, and the countless moods of the Mississippi acquired through decades upon its waters. During periods of unusually low water, careful judgment determined whether heavily loaded vessels should continue or temporarily await rising levels. Spring floods demanded equal caution, for familiar channels occasionally disappeared beneath immense expanses of swift-moving water that transformed the appearance of the entire valley. The great packets themselves deserved careful observation, for no two appeared entirely alike. Some had been constructed for speed, their long, graceful hulls cutting cleanly through the current as though eager for the next landing beyond the horizon. Others emphasized strength above elegance, carrying astonishing quantities of freight upon broad decks supported by massive timber framing. Their towering smokestacks released slow columns of dark smoke that drifted across the valley before dissolving into the morning sky. Brilliant white paint reflected the sunlight. Polished brass fittings caught every passing ray, and broad paddle wheels threw shimmering arcs of river water high into the air with every measured revolution. To a child standing along the bank, these vessels appeared less like ordinary machines than floating towns quietly making their way between distant communities. Life aboard a riverboat followed an order that remained almost invisible to those watching from shore. Engineers tended the great steam engines whose steady heartbeat powered every journey. Firemen labored before roaring furnaces, feeding cordwood into blazing fireboxes despite the tremendous heat. Pilots occupied the elevated wheelhouse, where wide windows afforded uninterrupted views of shifting channels ahead. Deckhands secured freight, adjusted lines, and prepared gangplanks at every landing. Cooks transformed simple provisions into generous meals served within elegant dining saloons, whose polished woodwork and crystal lamps surprised many first-time passengers accustomed to rough frontier travel. Throughout the voyage, each individual contributed quietly to a remarkable harmony that allowed the vessel to glide steadily along one of the continent's greatest rivers. The river itself never surrendered entirely to human confidence. Sandbars appeared where deep channels had existed only weeks before. Falling cottonwoods sometimes drifted beneath the surface, their submerged trunks threatening unwary hulls. Dense morning fog occasionally concealed even familiar landmarks until the pilot relied almost entirely upon memory, compass, current, and careful sounding. During such hours, the steamboat advanced with deliberate caution while passengers gathered silently along the rails, watching the pale mist slowly reveal the outlines of wooded islands and limestone bluffs emerging one by one from the whiteness. When the sun finally dispersed the fog, conversation resumed with quiet relief, as though the river itself had gently tested every soul aboard before allowing the journey to continue. Not every landing possessed imposing warehouses or crowded levees. Many consisted of little more than a narrow clearing where several barrels awaited collection beneath a spreading cottonwood. A simple wooden warehouse stood nearby, beside a rough wagon track disappearing into the interior. At the captain's signal, the gangplank descended. Freight exchanged hands with practiced efficiency. Several passengers boarded or departed, and within minutes, the paddle wheels resumed their familiar cadence. The stop had lasted only moments, yet for isolated farming communities, these brief visits represented a vital connection with markets, mail, newspapers, medicines, books, and relatives living far beyond the county's borders. River commerce followed the changing calendar with remarkable faithfulness. Spring brought swollen currents carrying fresh timber, agricultural products, and increasing numbers of emigrants bound for new homes farther west. Summer lengthened the working day as clear weather encouraged almost continuous navigation, though experienced captains remained watchful for sudden thunderstorms sweeping across the valley. Autumn became perhaps the busiest season of all. Harvests from surrounding farms descended toward the landings in an almost unbroken procession of wagons loaded with grain, apples, tobacco, flour, and livestock destined for markets hundreds of miles away. Winter altered rather than ended the rhythm. Ice occasionally restricted movement, and bitter winds swept unhindered along the broad river. Yet commerce resumed whenever conditions permitted. For too many communities depended upon these faithful vessels to remain idle for long. Standing upon the bluffs above the Mississippi at sunset, one could witness the county's defining landscape gathered into a single peaceful view. Below, broad paddle-wheel packets traced slow paths across water, burnished by the declining sun. Wagon roads descended through orchards toward the levees, where warehouses cast long shadows upon the shoreline. Church steeples rose above mature groves, while smoke drifted gently from scattered farmhouses, occupying the higher ground beyond the floodplain. The steady beat of paddle wheels blended with distant church bells, the calls of waterfowl settling among quiet backwaters, and the soft rustling of cottonwoods lining the river's edge. It was a landscape neither entirely rural nor wholly commercial, but one in which the great river patiently united every occupation, every village, and every household into a single enduring community. Along the waterfront, the day's activity slowly yielded to the gentler pace of evening. Warehouse doors closed one by one, and the final freight wagons departed the levee beneath gathering shadows. B.A. Teamsters loosened harnesses, while tired horses lowered their heads gratefully beside watering troughs. River pilots studied tomorrow's weather before retiring to their cabins, and deckhands completed the last inspections of ropes, boilers, and paddle housings beneath the warm glow of hanging lanterns. The Mississippi itself reflected every flickering light upon its broad surface until river and sky appeared almost indistinguishable beneath the first emerging stars. Even in these quieter hours, one sensed that the county's lifeblood continued flowing steadily with the current, carrying both commerce and memory toward distant shores. For many families living beyond the immediate riverfront, the arrival of the evening packet became an event anticipated with quiet expectation. The county postwriter often reached nearby villages only after the steamboat had delivered fresh mail. Newspapers printed several days earlier in Cincinnati, Louisville, or New Orleans passed from hand to hand within stores, hotels, and homes before eventually reaching isolated farmhouses. Letters bearing familiar handwriting crossed hundreds of river miles before resting upon walnut kitchen tables, where they were opened carefully beneath lamplight. News of births, marriages, harvests, business ventures, military service, illnesses, and safe arrivals traveled upon the same vessels that carried flour, timber, and livestock. Thus, the river united not merely markets, but families whose lives extended far beyond the visible horizon. Steamboats also carried knowledge. Crates filled with school books, atlases, religious texts, agricultural journals, scientific publications, and literary works arrived regularly at county landings before continuing inland by wagon. Rural teachers eagerly awaited new readers for their pupils. Ministers received theological works from Eastern publishers. Physicians ordered updated medical references that reflected the latest understanding available to 19th century practice. Merchants subscribed to commercial journals reporting market conditions from cities separated by hundreds of miles. Although many households remained geographically distant from the nation's great publishing centers, the Mississippi quietly ensured that ideas traveled almost as faithfully as freight itself. As darkness settled completely across the valley, another steamboat whistle drifted through the still air with remarkable clarity. Its echo rolled slowly against the limestone bluffs before fading into the wooded ravines beyond. Farmers, pausing beside their barns, recognized the familiar sound almost instinctively. Children listening from upstairs windows imagined the brightly illuminated vessel continuing its patient journey beneath the stars. Along lonely stretches of riverbank, fishermen, resting beside small campfires, briefly lifted their gaze toward the passing lights reflected upon the current. Few sounds became more deeply woven into the county's nightly atmosphere than the distant whistle of a packet moving steadily along the Mississippi. When the morning packet disappeared around the next bend of the Mississippi, life within St. Louis County did not become quieter so much as different. The broad river surrendered its place to the inland roads, where another current of travel continued with equal steadiness, though at a gentler pace. Here, beneath arching oaks and beside limestone fences weathered by countless seasons, wagons rolled patiently toward villages whose prosperity depended as much upon dependable roads as upon the great river itself. The rhythm of horse hooves replaced the measured turning of paddle wheels, yet both belonged to the same enduring landscape. Leaving the river valley, travelers gradually climbed the limestone bluffs, where fresh breezes carried the fragrance of wild grasses and newly turned earth. The ascent revealed broad views across the Mississippi floodplain. Steamboats that had appeared immense from the levee now resembled graceful white birds gliding through distant ribbons of silver water. Behind them stretched wooded islands, quiet backwaters, and fertile bottomlands, enriched each year by the river's patient generosity. Before the traveler, however, another world unfolded, a countryside of rolling uplands, where farms, orchards, churches, mills, and scattered settlements quietly shaped the everyday character of the county. The roads themselves reflected generations of practical experience rather than formal engineering. Surveyors frequently followed ancient native trails and older French trading routes whose courses had already proven the easiest passage through hills, valleys, and stream crossings. Bellefontaine Road carried farmers and merchants northward through productive agricultural districts. Manchester Road gradually extended westward toward expanding settlements beyond the older communities near the Mississippi. Gravois Road wound across ridges whose elevated ground remained passable during seasons when lower routes surrendered to mud and floodwaters. Every road possessed its own personality, determined by the surrounding landscape as much as by those who traveled it. Every journey required thoughtful preparation. Before sunrise, farmers inspected wagon wheels, tightened leather harnesses, and fed sturdy teams whose quiet strength determined the success of the day's travel. Flour destined for the river landings rested beneath heavy canvas coverings. Orchard fruit occupied carefully arranged baskets, cushioned with fresh straw to protect delicate peaches and apples from rough roads. Butter remained packed inside cool crocks, while eggs traveled within specially constructed wooden crates designed to survive even the deepest wagon ruts. Nothing entered the wagon carelessly. Years of experience had taught every family that careful loading often proved as valuable as careful farming. During spring, the roads demanded remarkable patience. Melting snow and frequent rains transformed stretches of rich Missouri clay into heavy mud, capable of delaying even experienced teamsters. Horses leaned steadily into their collars, while wagon wheels disappeared nearly to their hubs before slowly emerging once again with every determined step forward. Neighbors rarely passed such scenes without offering assistance. Additional teams were gladly provided where difficult hills required greater strength, and many a heavily burdened wagon reached its destination only because several families paused their own journeys long enough to lend willing hands. These quiet acts seldom appeared within county records, yet they reflected a spirit of cooperation remembered far longer than individual hardships. With the arrival of summer, travel became noticeably easier. Dry roads echoed beneath iron-rimmed wheels as merchants, ministers, physicians, school teachers, craftsmen, and ordinary farming families moved steadily between villages. Shade from immense oaks and walnuts offered welcome relief during the warmest hours of afternoon. Beside many roads stood carefully maintained watering troughs, supplied by cool limestone springs where horses rested briefly before continuing their journey. Inns appeared at practical intervals along the more heavily traveled routes, welcoming both local residents and strangers whose travels carried them through the county toward destinations farther west. By late afternoon, the crossroads inns became gentle gathering places rather than hurried stations. Their wide porches overlooked the passing road, allowing travelers to observe the quiet procession of county life, while horses rested in shaded hitching yards nearby. Inside, polished walnut tables bore simple but generous meals prepared from local farms. Fresh bread still carried warmth from the morning oven. Butter rested cool within stone crocks. Smoked ham, orchard preserves, apple butter, roasted poultry, and seasonal vegetables appeared according to the time of year rather than distant fashion. Conversation flowed softly across the dining room, seldom rising above the pleasant crackling of the hearth during cooler months, or the open windows that admitted birdsong and the fragrance of nearby hayfields during summer. Many journeys through the county were not undertaken for commerce alone. Sundays transformed these familiar roads into quiet avenues of worship. Families departed their homes before church bells sounded across the valleys, fathers guiding wagons with patient confidence, while mothers steadied well-worn hymnals, and children admired the familiar landscape passing slowly beside them. Dresses carefully pressed the evening before contrasted with dark wool coats brushed free of road dust. Horses seemed almost to recognize the weekly custom, maintaining an unhurried pace toward white-painted churches whose slender steeples gradually appeared above groves of oak and maple. As neighboring wagons met along the road, greetings required little ceremony. Familiar faces, exchanged smiles, and courteous gestures reflected communities whose members knew one another through generations of shared seasons rather than hurried acquaintance. Education likewise followed these same roads. Small one-room schools stood at practical intervals throughout the county, their simple timber walls surrounded by split-rail fences and modest playgrounds shaded beneath mature trees. Each morning, children arrived on foot, horseback, or in family wagons before carefully placing firewood beside the cast-iron stove during colder weather. Their lessons extended well beyond reading and arithmetic. Geography introduced distant rivers that many would never see, while history connected their own county with the broader republic steadily unfolding beyond Missouri. Between recitations, the open windows admitted the songs of meadowlarks, the distant ringing of blacksmith hammers, and the occasional rumble of freight wagons continuing patiently along nearby roads. Blacksmith shops occupied an equally important place within this inland world. Their forges glowed warmly even on bright afternoons, announcing their presence long before the buildings themselves appeared. The measured ringing of hammer upon anvil echoed across adjoining fields with reassuring familiarity. Farmers arrived carrying broken wagon fittings, worn horseshoes, cracked plowshares, bent hinges, and countless small tools whose repair often proved far less costly than replacement. The village blacksmith possessed not merely strength, but remarkable judgment. A skilled eye distinguished sound iron from weakened metal, while practiced hands restored usefulness to objects upon which entire households depended. Sparks briefly illuminated the dim workshop before disappearing into the scent of coal smoke, hot iron, leather harness, and freshly worked timber. Not every traveler hurried toward a destination already marked upon a map. Some arrived seeking land upon which to begin entirely new lives. Government surveys, county deeds, and contemporary records suggest that throughout the 19th century, many families journeyed westward through Louis County before settling either within its borders or farther beyond the Missouri frontier. Their first impressions often remained remarkably similar. They remembered the broad rivers, the limestone bluffs glowing beneath evening light, the fertile uplands stretching beyond the wooded valleys, and the reassuring appearance of well-established farms whose orderly fences and prosperous orchards promised stability within an expanding nation. For countless newcomers, the county represented both a destination and a gateway, standing quietly between the older East and the immense landscapes still unfolding beyond the Missouri River. As twilight settled once more across the uplands, the roads gradually emptied beneath long shadows cast by ancient trees. Farm gates closed softly after the final wagon had returned from market. Churchyards rested in perfect stillness, save for the evening chorus of crickets. Smoke rose gently above stone chimneys, while the last rays of sunlight lingered upon distant limestone bluffs overlooking the Mississippi. Far below, almost hidden by gathering dusk, another steamboat whistle echoed faintly across the valley, reminding every traveler that although the inland roads had carried them through fields, forests, villages, and quiet homes, all paths within the county ultimately remained connected to the patient river, whose broad waters continued their endless journey southward. Throughout the year, county officials devoted quiet attention to maintaining these essential roads. Their work rarely attracted public celebration, yet without it, much of the county's commerce would have faltered. Contemporary county records frequently mention petitions requesting repairs to bridges, improvements to troublesome crossings, or the clearing of fallen timber after powerful storms. Rather than imposing grand engineering schemes upon the landscape, road supervisors generally worked with it. Limestone, gathered from nearby outcrops, strengthened muddy approaches. Heavy oak beams supported modest bridges spanning creeks, whose peaceful appearance often concealed surprisingly forceful spring currents. Drainage ditches were opened where rainwater habitually collected, allowing future travelers to pass with greater ease. Every repaired culvert and every freshly laid stone represented another quiet investment in the county's daily life. Covered bridges, though never as numerous as in certain eastern states, possessed a quiet dignity wherever they appeared across the county's broader streams. Their sturdy timber frames sheltered both travelers and the bridge itself from weather that would otherwise hasten decay. Entering such a structure briefly transformed the journey. Bright afternoon sunlight yielded to cool shadow. The rhythmic sound of wagon wheels changed from soft earth to resonant wooden planks, and narrow windows framed fleeting views of sparkling water flowing beneath. Horses instinctively slowed their pace, while the scent of fresh timber mingled with damp limestone carried upward from the creek below. Emerging once again into open countryside, travelers resumed their journey, as though passing through a brief wooden gateway, joining one peaceful valley to the next. Autumn perhaps revealed the county roads at their most beautiful. Harvest wagons traveled steadily toward mills and markets, while forests surrounding the uplands glowed with amber, russet, bronze, and muted gold. Fallen leaves gathered gently beside split-rail fences where squirrels prepared quietly for the approaching winter. Orchard workers climbed ladders resting against mature apple trees whose branches bowed beneath abundant fruit. Along Manchester Road and Gravois Road, countless wagons carried pumpkins, corn, wheat, apples, cider barrels, smoked meats, and freshly milled flour toward nearby villages and river landings. Every mile reflected the quiet satisfaction of another successful growing season completed through patient labor rather than sudden fortune. Winter altered the county without diminishing its quiet beauty. Bare branches revealed distant church steeples previously hidden behind dense summer foliage. Snow softened the familiar outlines of fences, barns, and stone farmhouses, while wagon tracks became crisp impressions crossing white fields toward smoke rising from welcoming chimneys. Frost glittered upon orchard branches beneath pale morning sunlight, and the creeks whose lively waters had turned mill wheels during warmer months now flowed more slowly beneath delicate shelves of ice. Travel continued whenever conditions permitted. Sleigh runners occasionally replaced wagon wheels upon well-packed snow, their gentle whisper across frozen roads contrasting pleasantly with the usual creaking of timber and iron. If the rivers carried the county's commerce and the roads united its villages, it was the farm that sustained its daily existence. Beyond the river landings and away from the busy crossroads, the greater portion of 19th century St. Louis County awakened each morning to the quieter occupations of agriculture. Here, beneath the shelter of ancient oaks and along the gentle ridges overlooking the Mississippi Valley, generations shaped a landscape where nearly every field, orchard, pasture, and fence reflected years of careful labor rather than sudden transformation. The first signs of daylight seldom arrived with silence. Before sunrise, smoke already rose from limestone chimneys whose fireplaces had been stirred back into life after the coolness of the night. Roosters announced the coming morning from weathered fence rails. Milk pails gently rang against one another as they were carried toward waiting dairy barns. Stable doors opened with familiar creaks, and horses greeted the day with quiet snorts, while fresh hay was distributed into wooden mangers. Across nearby pastures, cattle gradually emerged from lingering mist that rested low within the valleys before retreating beneath the warmth of the rising sun. Even before breakfast appeared upon the table, much of the day's work had already begun. Unlike the immense plantations found farther south, or the vast prairie farms that would later characterize portions of the Great Plains, many farms throughout Street. Levee County remained moderate in size and closely connected to the surrounding communities. Contemporary agricultural records and census returns suggested remarkable diversity rather than uniformity. Wheat occupied one field while corn ripened beside it. Oats, rye, hay, vegetables, orchard fruit, dairy, cattle, hogs, sheep, and poultry together formed balanced farms capable of sustaining both household needs and local markets. Such variety reduced dependence upon any single harvest and reflected generations of practical experience acquired through observation rather than speculation. The farmhouse itself seldom stood alone. Around it gradually accumulated an entire working landscape, arranged according to necessity rather than ornament. Nearby stood broad timber barns, whose hand-hewn beams reflected the craftsmanship of local carpenters, smokehouses preserved pork through careful curing, spring houses constructed beside cool limestone springs protected butter, milk, and fresh food throughout the warmer months. Corn cribs elevated above the ground guarded precious grain against dampness and unwelcome pests. Chicken houses, wagon sheds, tool rooms, and fenced kitchen gardens completed the homestead, each structure occupying its place through long familiarity rather than formal design. Fruit orchards deserved particular admiration throughout the county. Apple varieties suited to Missouri's climate flourished upon gently sloping ground, where morning sunlight dried dew from delicate blossoms. Peach orchards brightened entire hillsides each spring with pale flowers whose fragrance drifted softly upon warm breezes. Pear, cherry, and plum trees completed many family plantings, while grape arbors reflected both French colonial traditions and the continuing influence of later German settlers. During autumn, the orchards became scenes of cheerful industry. Ladders rested carefully against mature branches, while woven baskets gradually filled with carefully selected fruit destined for nearby markets, cider mills, household cellars, and drying racks prepared for the coming winter. Throughout these seasons, the county's signature rivers remained quietly present even beyond the horizon. Fertile soils owed much to ancient geological processes shaped by the Mississippi and Missouri long before the first homestead had appeared. Gentle breezes rising from the valleys moderated summer heat, while distant steamboat whistles occasionally reached the uplands, faintly reminding farmers that beyond their orchards and harvested fields, the broad river still carried the fruits of their labor toward distant cities. Farm work unfolded according to the seasons, with a steadiness that required little attention from the calendar itself. Spring demanded preparation rather than harvest. Fields were turned with sturdy iron plows, drawn patiently by teams of horses or oxen, their deep furrows exposing the rich, dark earth that had rested through winter. Seed corn was planted by practiced hands, moving methodically across each carefully measured row. Wheat, already sown the previous autumn, awakened beneath lengthening days, covering the rolling uplands with soft growth that bent gracefully before every passing breeze. Along the edges of cultivated ground, wildflowers blossomed undisturbed, where split-rail fences met woodland, providing quiet shelter for songbirds whose melodies accompanied nearly every hour of labor. Summer brought longer days and heavier responsibilities. Haymaking occupied entire households whenever clear weather promised several consecutive days without rain. Mowers passed steadily through tall meadows, while the sweet fragrance of freshly cut grass drifted across neighboring farms. Children gathered loose stalks with wooden rakes, scarcely taller than themselves, while older family members carefully stacked the drying hay into orderly windrows before loading it upon broad wagons. By evening, immense barns gradually filled with fragrant fodder that would sustain livestock through the coming winter. Even after sunset, the scent of new hay lingered warmly beneath the heavy timber roofs where swallows circled quietly among the rafters before settling for the night. Livestock represented an equally important measure of prosperity. Dairy cattle grazed peacefully within fenced pastures, bordered by walnut and sycamore trees, whose generous shade protected them during the hottest afternoons. Hogs wandered oak groves where autumn acorns supplemented their feed with remarkable abundance. Sheep grazed upon higher ground where shorter grasses flourished, their wool later spun into garments that warmed entire households through Missouri winters. Horses remained the indispensable companions of nearly every family, plowing fields, hauling wagons, carrying riders to church, and drawing sleighs across snow-covered roads when winter settled over the county. Farmers often knew each animal individually, not merely as property, but as faithful partners whose quiet endurance shaped the success of every season. The kitchen garden completed the rhythm of the homestead. Carefully enclosed by sturdy fences, these productive plots yielded beans, onions, cabbages, potatoes, carrots, squash, herbs, lettuce, peas, and countless other vegetables suited to local conditions. Medicinal herbs occupied their own orderly corners where mint, sage, thyme, chamomile, and other useful plants grew beside flowering borders that attracted bees throughout the warmer months. Nearby stood rows of currants, gooseberries, and raspberries whose fruit enriched household preserves prepared during the height of summer. Nothing within these gardens appeared accidental. Every path, trellis, and planting reflected years of thoughtful adjustment passed quietly from one generation to the next. Winter evenings within the farmhouse revealed another dimension of county life seldom visible from the road. After the final chores had been completed and stable doors secured against the cold, Families gathered around broad fireplaces where oak and hickory logs burned with steady warmth. Candlelight reflected softly from well-used family Bibles, hymn books, agricultural journals, and treasured volumes whose pages had accompanied several generations. Women mended clothing, quilted blankets, or prepared preserves for the coming year, while men repaired harnesses, carved tool handles, or studied seed catalogs and farming almanacs. Children listened quietly as older relatives recalled earlier seasons, remarkable floods upon the Mississippi, memorable harvests, or journeys made by riverboat long before the youngest members of the household had been born. Outside, snow rested silently across the orchards and limestone fields. Yet within these homes, the quiet continuity of family life endured from one winter to the next. The close of winter quietly prepared the beginning of another year. As February gradually yielded to March, small changes appeared almost unnoticed across the countryside. Snow retreated first from the southern slopes where sunlight lingered longest. Clear water once again murmured beneath thin shelves of melting ice, and the limestone springs that had never wholly surrendered to winter resumed their lively course through familiar creek valleys. Bluebirds returned to orchard fences. Red-winged blackbirds gathered among the marshes nearer the Mississippi, while the first buds upon apple and peach trees hinted at another season, whose promise rested silently within every branch. For farming families, these earliest signs carried practical meaning rather than mere beauty. Barns that had sheltered livestock through the cold months gradually emptied as cattle returned to fresh pasture. Fields were inspected with experienced eyes, fences repaired where winter winds had loosened rails, and seed carefully measured from stores preserved since the previous harvest. Blacksmiths found themselves unusually busy as plowshares required sharpening and wagon fittings demanded attention before the heavy labors of spring recommenced. The county seemed to awaken together, not through sudden transformation, but through thousands of familiar tasks repeated faithfully from one generation to another. In every direction, the landscape reflected remarkable harmony between labor and nature. Orchards followed the contours of gentle hills rather than forcing straight lines across them. Barns occupied elevated ground safely above seasonal floods. Cornfields extended where sunlight proved most generous, while woodlots remained standing upon steeper ridges whose mature oaks and walnuts continued supplying fuel, lumber, and shelter for wildlife. Contemporary agricultural observers frequently admired this practical balance. The county's prosperity depended not merely upon fertile soil, but upon generations who had gradually learned to work with the landscape rather than against it. As evening settled gently across the rolling uplands, the farmsteads beneath the limestone bluffs once again became islands of warm light within a broadening sea of twilight. Smoke drifted peacefully above weathered chimneys. The final wagon returned from a neighboring mill. Horses rested comfortably within timber stables after another day's faithful labor, while the faint whistle of a distant riverboat rose once more from the Mississippi below. Though unseen from many farms, the river remained quietly present, carrying outward the harvests, flour, livestock, timber, and orchard fruit produced by these patient households. In return, it brought books, letters, tools, new neighbors, and distant ideas that gradually became part of county life. Thus, the farm and the river, though separated by wooded ridges and winding roads, remained bound together as naturally as the two great rivers whose meeting had first given this remarkable county its enduring character. Long before the courthouse assembled its records, and before newspapers carried the week's events from one settlement to another, the strongest ties within St. Louis County had often been formed beneath church roofs. Across the rolling uplands, along shaded creek valleys, and beside the older French villages near the Mississippi, church bells marked the passing of both ordinary weeks and extraordinary moments. Their voices drifted gently above orchards, crossed harvested fields, echoed from limestone bluffs, and finally disappeared into the broad valley where riverboats continued their patient journeys. Few sounds belonged more completely to the county than these bells, whose measured ringing united households separated by miles of woodland and winding roads. The oldest congregations reflected the county's deep French heritage. Stone Catholic churches, some tracing their origins to the colonial era, stood with quiet dignity among mature trees whose roots had witnessed generations of worshippers. Thick limestone walls remained cool through the heat of summer, while narrow windows admitted soft shafts of light that rested upon polished wooden pews and well-worn prayer books. Candles flickered gently before the altar as familiar families gathered each Sabbath morning, many bearing surnames that appeared repeatedly within parish registers preserved across successive generations. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals quietly entered those carefully written records, creating an enduring genealogy of the county that survived long after individual voices had fallen silent. Elsewhere throughout the countryside, Protestant meeting houses gradually appeared beside expanding settlements established by families arriving from Kentucky, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Ohio, and the eastern states. Their architecture generally reflected modesty rather than ornament. White painted timber walls, plain rectangular windows, and slender steeples rose above small churchyards enclosed by simple fences. The buildings possessed little unnecessary decoration, yet their simplicity harmonized beautifully with the surrounding fields and forests. On Sunday mornings, wagons gathered beneath spreading oaks while horses waited patiently among hitching rails, their quiet movements scarcely disturbing the peaceful stillness before worship began. The church served purposes extending far beyond religious devotion alone. Here, neighbors renewed acquaintances interrupted by the week's labor. Young couples quietly began friendships that sometimes matured into marriages celebrated beneath the same roof years later. Newly arrived families found introductions easier within the welcoming company of established congregations. Notices concerning community improvements, charitable assistance, harvest gatherings, school meetings, and road repairs often circulated after the final hymn had concluded. Thus, the church quietly strengthened the social fabric of the county with every passing season, weaving together farms, villages, mills, and river communities into relationships founded upon familiarity rather than mere proximity. Education shared this same spirit of community. Throughout much of the 19th century, the schoolhouse stood beside the church as one of the county's most valued institutions. Though generally modest in appearance, these one-room buildings nurtured ambitions extending far beyond their simple walls. Their sturdy timber frames sheltered children whose futures might lead them toward farming, commerce, teaching, craftsmanship, ministry, medicine, or public service. Morning sunlight entered broad windows before falling across rough-hewn desks carefully polished by generations of eager hands. Slates rested beside McGuffey readers, copybooks, arithmetic texts, and well-used maps whose edges gradually softened beneath years of careful study. Teachers commanded respect not through sternness alone, but through quiet example. Many traveled considerable distances each week along the county roads, boarding with local families according to long-standing custom. Their responsibilities extended beyond instruction. They maintained discipline with fairness, encouraged careful penmanship, introduced geography far beyond Missouri's borders, and cultivated habits of reading that often remained with their pupils throughout life. During winter evenings, it was not uncommon for older scholars or neighboring adults to gather within the schoolhouse for community lectures, debates, spelling contests, or readings from newspapers and literary works recently delivered by Steamboat. Within these quiet schoolrooms, learning seldom remained confined to books alone. Geography lessons frequently began with maps hanging beside the teacher's desk. Yet, before long, they returned to the familiar landscape beyond the windows. Children traced the course of the Mississippi from northern forests toward the distant Gulf, then looked outside toward the same valley whose broad waters they had crossed beside their parents. They learned the names of the Missouri, the Merrimack, and the Des Peres, not merely as lines upon paper, but as rivers and streams, whose valleys shaped the farms, roads, and villages surrounding their own homes. History likewise assumed a local character. The French foundations of nearby settlements, the gradual arrival of American pioneers, and the county's growing importance as a gateway to the western frontier transformed distant national events into stories connected with familiar places. Books remained treasured possessions throughout the county. Family Bibles occupied honored places within many households, their blank pages carefully recording births, marriages, and deaths in handwriting that quietly preserved family histories across generations. Shelves held hymn books worn smooth by years of Sunday worship, agricultural manuals consulted before each planting season, almanacs whose weather predictions invited annual discussion, and treasured literary works read aloud beside winter fires. Newspapers arriving by riverboat found eager readers within village stores, inns, and homes before passing from neighbor to neighbor until every page had been studied. Though separated from eastern publishing centers by hundreds of miles, the county never remained isolated from the printed world for long. Libraries, though modest compared with those of larger cities, gradually appeared through the efforts of churches, schools, private societies, and civic-minded citizens. Reading circles met quietly during the colder months, selecting works of history, poetry, travel, or practical science that encouraged thoughtful conversation rather than debate alone. Ministers exchanged theological volumes with neighboring congregations. Teachers borrowed atlases and natural history texts to enrich classroom lessons. Young readers discovered the wider world through carefully preserved books whose pages carried the faint scent of leather, paper, and candle smoke accumulated over many winters. In such ways, learning became woven naturally into ordinary county life without disturbing its peaceful rhythm. Community gatherings often united education, faith, and fellowship beneath the same roof. School exhibitions invited parents to witness recitations, penmanship, and musical performances prepared through months of careful practice. Church socials filled long tables with pies, preserves, roasted meats, fresh bread, orchard fruit, and cakes whose recipes reflected the county's French, German, and American traditions alike. Harvest suppers celebrated successful seasons while quietly providing assistance to neighbors whose fortunes had been less generous. Conversation wandered easily from weather and crops to books, family news, river conditions, and plans for repairing bridges or improving local roads. No single subject dominated the evening. Rather, the gathering itself strengthened those quiet bonds upon which the county depended. The passing seasons lent each congregation and school its own familiar atmosphere. Spring weddings filled churchyards with blossoming apple branches gathered from nearby orchards. Summer windows remained open during worship, allowing bird song and gentle breezes from the Mississippi Valley to mingle softly with hymns. Autumn harvest festivals decorated meeting halls with corn shocks, pumpkins, apples, wheat sheaves, and late flowers gathered from surrounding farms. Winter transformed these same buildings into warm refuges where snow-covered boots rested beside glowing stoves while neighbors exchanged greetings before services began. Through every season, the same roads, rivers, and limestone bluffs quietly connected these places of learning and worship, reminding each generation that the county's greatest strength rested not in commerce alone, but in the enduring fellowship of ordinary families who shared the same landscape, the same labor, and the same hopeful regard for those who would follow after them. The quiet influence of these institutions often became most visible during times of hardship. When illness visited a household, church members appeared without ceremony carrying baskets of bread, smoked meat, fresh butter, preserves, or firewood cut from nearby woodlots. If a barn had been damaged by wind or lightning, neighbors organized work parties that restored heavy timber frames with remarkable speed. When harvest threatened to outpace the strength of a single family, surrounding farms quietly contributed teams, wagons, and willing hands until every field had been gathered. Such acts rarely entered newspapers or official county records, yet they formed the invisible framework upon which everyday life depended within street. Louis County community was not merely spoken of, it was practiced through countless ordinary kindnesses that expected little recognition beyond gratitude itself. The church bell, whose voice had welcomed worshipers each Sabbath, also marked life's most solemn passages. It rang gently for funerals that gathered several generations beneath familiar trees whose shade had witnessed baptisms and weddings many years before. Processions moved slowly from church doors toward quiet burial grounds where limestone markers overlooked the same valleys, orchards, and winding roads the departed had known throughout their lives. Ministers spoke not only of faith, but of stewardship, family, and the enduring value of honest labor. As mourners returned home by wagon beneath the broad Missouri sky, the county itself seemed to continue their remembrance. The rivers flowed with unchanged patience, birds continued their songs among the woodland edges, and evening sunlight rested once more upon the limestone bluffs, reminding every generation that while individual lives passed quietly into history, the landscape faithfully preserved their memory. Although the broad rivers carried St. Louis County toward distant markets, much of its commercial life unfolded at a quieter pace within the villages scattered among the limestone hills and fertile valleys. Long before sunrise, wagons already traveled familiar roads toward market squares, where merchants prepared for another day of measured activity. Horses exhaled clouds of cool breath during autumn mornings. Iron-rimmed wheels murmured across packed earth. Lanterns glowed faintly beneath covered porches, while shopkeepers unlocked sturdy wooden shutters that had protected their windows through the night. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the upper branches of the oaks, the marketplace had already begun its gentle awakening. Unlike the immense commercial districts of eastern cities, the county markets retained an atmosphere that remained unmistakably local. Farmers rarely arrived as strangers. Merchants knew not only their names, but often the appearance of their orchards, the quality of their wheat, and the condition of their livestock. Buyers recognized which dairy farms produced especially fine butter, which families cultivated the sweetest peaches, and whose flour consistently emerged from the mill with remarkable whiteness. Transactions, therefore, rested upon reputation as much as upon price. A familiar handshake often carried equal weight with written receipts, while long-established trust quietly sustained commerce from one season to the next. The market itself displayed the remarkable abundance of the surrounding countryside. Wagons stood side by side beneath rows of shade trees, their beds filled with carefully arranged produce reflecting the county's varied agriculture. Bushels of apples rested beside baskets of pears and peaches gathered from hillside orchards. Fresh vegetables, smoked meats, eggs, butter packed within cool stone crocks, cheeses wrapped in clean linen, honey sealed in glass jars, and sacks of newly milled flour awaited local households and merchants preparing shipments toward the Mississippi landings. Poultry announced its presence from woven crates, while nearby horses stood patiently beside polished harnesses that had already carried their owners many miles before sunrise. No establishment contributed more faithfully to this quiet economy than the county mill. Wherever dependable streams descended from the uplands toward the Mississippi or the Merrimack, millers recognized opportunity within the steady current. Limestone creeks that appeared peaceful beside shaded woodlands possessed sufficient strength to turn great wooden water wheels whose patient motion transformed harvested grain into flour that nourished thousands. The mill seldom stood alone. Nearby rose the miller's comfortable dwelling, a timber barn, wagon sheds, grain storage buildings, and often a modest bridge crossing the stream, so approaching farmers might reach the grinding floor with greater ease. Throughout harvest season, the mill yard remained among the liveliest places in the county. Wagons waited in orderly succession while teams rested beneath sycamore trees bordering the cool stream. Farmers exchanged observations concerning rainfall, wheat yields, orchard prospects, river conditions, or the latest arrivals at the St. Louis levee. Within the mill itself, sunlight entered through narrow windows, revealing countless particles of flour drifting gently through the warm air like pale mist. Massive millstones revolved steadily beneath carefully adjusted machinery whose deep, rhythmic sound echoed reassuringly through every timber beam. The fragrance of fresh grain mingled with damp limestone, seasoned wood, and the cool freshness rising from the flowing creek below. Village stores completed the commercial landscape with a quiet reliability that extended well beyond trade alone. Their broad wooden counters displayed practical goods upon which ordinary households depended: bolts of calico and wool cloth, iron nails forged in eastern foundries, hand tools, lamp oil, cooking utensils, leather harness fittings, window glass, tobacco, coffee, tea, sugar, salt, and carefully measured spices whose long journeys had finally ended within this inland county. Shelves climbed almost to the ceiling, their contents arranged with deliberate order accumulated through years of experience rather than fashion. Behind the counter, the merchant maintained thick account books whose pages recorded not merely purchases, but enduring relationships between neighboring families. Many transactions proceeded upon credit until harvest, reflecting mutual confidence built over decades of honest dealing. The arrival of a freight wagon or river shipment often transformed an ordinary business day into a modest community occasion. Wooden crates bearing Eastern manufacturers' marks were opened carefully before curious customers eager to examine new tools, books, fabrics, agricultural implements, or household wares that had traveled hundreds of miles by rail, riverboat, and wagon before reaching the county. Children admired brightly illustrated almanacs and carefully bound storybooks, while their parents inspected improved plows, seed drills, cast-iron stoves, lanterns, or kitchen utensils promising greater convenience. Although such arrivals introduced quiet signs of progress, they seldom displaced the county's established customs. New inventions were welcomed thoughtfully, tested patiently, and adopted only after proving themselves useful within the practical rhythm of farm and village life. Artisans, likewise, occupied respected places within the marketplace. Wheelwrights shaped seasoned oak and hickory into remarkably durable wagon wheels whose strength determined the safety of countless journeys. Coopers patiently assembled barrels destined for flour, cider, pork, and apples, their precisely fitted staves held firmly together by iron hoops skillfully forged nearby. Cabinet makers transformed walnut, cherry, and maple, harvested from local woodlands, into handsome furniture, whose graceful proportions reflected both practicality and quiet elegance. Harness makers stitched leather with remarkable precision, while tinsmiths fashioned buckets, lanterns, cups, roof flashing, and countless household articles from shining sheets of metal. Their workshops filled the streets with familiar sounds, the steady rasp of planes, the measured tapping of mallets, the ringing of small hammers, and the pleasant fragrance of fresh timber mingled with leather, linseed oil, and warm iron. Professional men also found their place within these modest commercial districts. Physicians maintained offices where shelves of carefully labeled glass bottles stood beside medical texts delivered from Eastern publishers. Lawyers occupied rooms overlooking courthouse squares, surrounded by orderly collections of legal volumes, county plats, deeds, and probate records, upon which families often depended for generations. Surveyors, carrying chains, compasses, and carefully folded maps, periodically departed toward distant farms, where property lines required clarification or newly purchased land awaited measurement. Printers quietly assembled each edition of the local newspaper, setting individual pieces of type by hand before operating sturdy presses whose rhythmic motion gradually spread news throughout the county. Though their occupations differed greatly, each profession contributed quietly to the orderly functioning of everyday life. The courthouse square possessed a character distinct from every other gathering place within the county. Here, commerce, government, and ordinary conversation blended almost imperceptibly beneath rows of mature shade trees. Farmers who had completed business at the market paused upon wooden benches before beginning the journey home. Attorneys crossed the square, carrying bundles of neatly tied documents. County officials welcomed citizens seeking licenses, deeds, tax records, or election notices, while horses rested quietly beside hitching rails that circled the courthouse lawn. On fair afternoons, the steady tolling of church bells from neighboring streets occasionally drifted across the square, mingling with the distant whistle of a Mississippi riverboat and reminding every listener that the county's civic life remained inseparable from its rivers, farms, villages, and faithful communities. The marketplace had never existed merely to exchange goods. It quietly preserved the relationships that allowed the entire county to prosper together. The marketplace gradually surrendered itself to evening with the same quiet dignity that had greeted the dawn. One by one, wagon beds stood noticeably lighter than they had in the early morning. Their flour, butter, orchard fruit, smoked meats, and vegetables exchanged for household necessities that would accompany families homeward. Merchants swept their thresholds before fastening heavy wooden shutters across broad windows polished by decades of sunlight. Account books were closed with deliberate care, their pages preserving another day's honest commerce among neighbors whose names had filled those ledgers for generations. The mill stream continued its patient murmur long after the final wagon departed. Its water neither hurried nor hesitated, turning the great wheel with the same dependable rhythm that had served fathers, sons, and grandsons alike. Beyond the village, smoke rose peacefully above scattered farmhouses where lamps now glowed behind small window panes. Horses walked the familiar roads toward waiting barns, their harness chains softly chiming with every measured step. Above the limestone bluffs, the evening sky slowly deepened into shades of amber and violet, while, from far below, the prolonged whistle of another Mississippi riverboat floated gently across the valley. That distant sound seemed almost to gather together everything the county had quietly produced during the passing day. Flour from the mills, apples from hillside orchards, timber from shaded woodlots, barrels shaped by skilled coopers, wagons repaired by patient wheelwrights, books unloaded at the general store, letters delivered from eastern cities, and the careful entries written within courthouse ledgers all belonged to the same unbroken rhythm. Commerce here had never been measured solely by profit. It had represented trust between neighbors, faithful workmanship, careful stewardship of the land, and the quiet confidence that tomorrow would begin much as today had ended. As darkness settled completely over the valleys, only scattered lanterns remained visible along the roads winding toward distant farmsteads. The marketplace rested until another sunrise would awaken its familiar voices once again. Yet even in stillness, the county continued its gentle conversation with the two great rivers. The Mississippi carried outward the fruits of countless ordinary hands, while returning boats brought fresh tools, printed books, hopeful settlers, and new ideas that gradually became woven into the fabric of local life. Thus, trade never disturbed the peaceful character of St. Louis County. Rather, like the steady turning of the mill wheel or the measured current of the river itself, it quietly sustained the homes, churches, schools, farms, and villages whose enduring harmony defined the county throughout the 19th century. For many years, the broad rivers remained the unquestioned highways of St. Louis County. Their dependable currents carried people, produce, timber, livestock, and correspondence with a certainty that no inland road could equal. Yet, as the 19th century advanced, another path gradually entered the county, not upon water, nor through the old wagon roads, but upon narrow ribbons of iron that stretched steadily across fields, valleys, and wooded ridges. The arrival of the railroad did not erase the older rhythms of the county. Instead, it quietly joined them, adding another voice to the familiar conversation already shared between riverboats, country roads, village markets, and peaceful farms. The first appearance of surveying parties often attracted thoughtful curiosity rather than excitement. Contemporary newspapers and county records describe engineers carrying chains, compasses, leveling instruments, and carefully rolled maps as they walked patiently across pastureland and woodland alike. Farmers paused beside split-rail fences to observe their measurements. Children followed at a respectful distance, wondering why slender wooden stakes suddenly appeared across otherwise familiar fields. The surveyors themselves rarely hurried. Every creek crossing, limestone ridge, gentle slope, and wooded hollow required careful examination before a practical route could be selected through the varied landscape of the county. Construction brought a different kind of labor than the fields had long known. Teams of horses hauled immense oak timbers destined to become railroad ties. Stonecutters opened nearby limestone quarries where carefully dressed blocks strengthened culverts, bridge abutments, and embankments. Blacksmiths found increasing demand for iron fittings, while carpenters shaped heavy beams into trestles, crossing streams that had previously been bridged only by modest wagon crossings. Though the work introduced unfamiliar sights, it remained firmly rooted in the county's traditional craftsmanship. Local timber, local limestone, and local labor quietly combined with new engineering methods to create the expanding line. The first locomotives inspired quiet admiration throughout the surrounding countryside. Their distant whistles differed greatly from the familiar calls of Mississippi steamboats, yet both soon became accepted sounds within the county's daily life. Long before the engine itself appeared, a faint column of smoke could often be seen rising above woodland or beyond a distant ridge. Children waiting beside safe crossings counted the approaching freight cars with delighted patience, while older residents regarded the passing trains with thoughtful interest, recognizing that another chapter in the county's history had quietly begun. Railroad depots soon became modest centers of activity within the communities fortunate enough to receive them. Unlike the lively river levees, these stations possessed a calmer order. Freight wagons arrived, carrying barrels of flour, orchard fruit packed in wooden crates, butter stored within cool crocks, wool carefully baled after spring shearing, and livestock awaiting shipment toward larger markets. Passengers gathered beneath broad station roofs, carrying carpet bags, leather trunks, and carefully wrapped parcels. Telegraph wires stretched away beside the tracks, their slender lines gently following the railroad across fields and valleys, where only birds had previously crossed so directly. The railroad altered the daily routines of many occupations without replacing the older ones. Riverboat captains still guided their vessels through the broad Mississippi Channel. Millers continued listening to the dependable turning of water wheels, and wagon roads remained busy from dawn until dusk. Yet merchants gradually learned that certain goods reached eastern markets more quickly upon the rails, while newspapers, books, machinery, and correspondence returned with increasing speed. Farmers noticed the difference almost imperceptibly. Improved agricultural implements began appearing more frequently in general stores. Fresh varieties of fruit trees reached county nurseries with greater regularity, and families occasionally received letters from distant relatives several days sooner than had once been expected. Progress arrived quietly, not through sudden upheaval, but through a gradual widening of opportunity. For the villages themselves, the railroad encouraged careful growth rather than restless expansion. Warehouses appeared beside the depots, where flour, lumber, grain, and orchard produce awaited shipment. Blacksmiths adapted their workshops to repair both wagon fittings and railroad equipment. Hotels welcomed commercial travelers who now arrived by train before continuing their journeys by carriage into the surrounding countryside. Teamsters transferred freight between depots and river landings, linking the iron road with the older waterways that had long sustained the county. Instead of competing with one another, rails, roads, and rivers gradually formed a single network whose quiet efficiency strengthened every settlement it touched. The changing landscape remained unmistakably that of St. Louis County. Locomotives crossed broad meadows where cattle continued grazing peacefully beneath walnut trees. Trains disappeared briefly into wooded hollows before emerging upon embankments overlooking limestone bluffs that had guided generations of river pilots. Telegraph poles stood beside orchards whose blossoms still announced every spring as faithfully as they always had. Even the occasional whistle of the engine seemed to answer, rather than replace, the familiar call of paddlewheel steamers drifting along the Mississippi below. The county accepted innovation without surrendering the peaceful character that had defined it since its earliest settlements. As evening approached, railroad stations settled into a familiar stillness, much like the river landings after the final packet boat had departed. Station masters carefully entered the day's freight and passenger accounts into neatly ruled ledgers before extinguishing office lamps one by one. Telegraph instruments clicked only occasionally as the final messages passed along the wires toward St. Louis or farther west. Freight wagons disappeared into gathering twilight, returning along country roads toward farms where lanterns already glowed warmly in kitchen windows. Beyond the station platform, rails stretched silently across fields silvered by the fading light, their polished surfaces reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. Yet even in this newer chapter of the county's history, the oldest landmarks remained unchanged. The Mississippi continued its unhurried journey past the limestone bluffs. Church bells still welcomed families each Sabbath. Watermills turned patiently beside shaded creeks. Orchards blossomed every spring, wheat ripened every summer, and smoke continued rising each evening above familiar farmhouses scattered across the uplands. The railroad had shortened distances, but it had not altered the enduring spirit of the county. Instead, it quietly joined the riverboats, wagon roads, markets, mills, churches, schools, and farms as another thread woven into the rich and unbroken fabric of 19th century Street. Lewis County. The railroad also influenced the quieter patterns of family life in ways that were seldom dramatic, yet deeply felt. Young men departing to pursue apprenticeships or commercial opportunities could return home with greater frequency than earlier generations had known. Visiting relatives arrived with fewer hardships after journeys that once required many days upon uncertain roads. Packages containing books, musical instruments, sewing machines, agricultural journals, and improved household tools reached farmsteads whose daily routines remained rooted in older customs. Each arrival reminded families that although the wider nation continued to expand rapidly beyond Missouri, their own county remained securely connected to it without surrendering the calm order that had long governed its villages and farms. Seasonal rhythms continued to shape railroad activity much as they had always governed river commerce. During harvest, freight cars stood ready beside country depots, while wagons arrived steadily from surrounding farms, carrying wheat, corn, apples, peaches, wool, tobacco, and barrels of cider. Winter brought shipments of seasoned timber, limestone, coal, and livestock, while spring welcomed nurserymen, receiving young fruit trees, and merchants unpacking fresh goods intended for another growing season. Summer often filled passenger coaches with families traveling toward St. Louis for business, education, or visits with relatives before returning once more to the quieter pace of county life. Thus, every season impressed its own character upon the iron road without altering the timeless procession of the year itself. Not every resident embraced these changes with equal enthusiasm. Surviving newspapers occasionally reflected thoughtful discussions concerning the balance between progress and preservation. Older citizens sometimes recalled the slower years when riverboats alone connected the county with distant places, while younger merchants welcomed the increasing efficiency of rail transportation. Yet such differences rarely disturbed the peaceful character of local communities. Practical experience soon demonstrated that both systems possessed their own strengths. Heavy cargo still found the Mississippi an economical highway, while passengers, correspondents, and certain manufactured goods benefited from the speed of the railroad. Together, they served the county more effectively than either could have done alone. Even the landscape itself appeared to reconcile these different forms of travel with remarkable grace. A traveler standing upon one of the limestone bluffs during a quiet autumn evening might have witnessed both a white paddlewheel steamer moving steadily along the broad Mississippi and far beyond the wooded ridges, the faint plume of a locomotive crossing the western horizon. Between them stretched orchards heavy with fruit, church steeples rising among mature trees, mills turning beside shaded creeks, villages resting beneath the warm glow of sunset, and farmhouses sending thin columns of wood smoke peacefully into the cooling air. The county revealed no conflict between old and new. Instead, every familiar feature continued to occupy its proper place within a landscape that had patiently absorbed each generation's contributions without losing its own enduring identity. As the 19th century advanced toward its closing decades, the outward appearance of St. Louis County changed in countless small ways, yet its deepest character remained remarkably constant. New houses rose beside older homesteads, whose hand-hewn beams had weathered half a century or more. Fresh orchards were planted while ancient apple trees, their trunks twisted by age, continued yielding faithful harvests. Railroads extended farther across the uplands, but the Mississippi still reflected the white silhouettes of paddlewheel steamers, whose measured progress remained one of the county's most familiar sights. Every generation inherited a landscape already shaped by those who had come before, adding its own careful improvements without erasing the quiet labor preserved within the fields, roads, churches, and villages. The changing seasons remained the truest calendar known to most families. Spring announced itself not by printed dates but through the swelling buds upon peach trees, the return of bluebirds to orchard fences, and the renewed murmur of limestone springs flowing beneath woodland shadows. Summer followed with fields of waving wheat, fragrant hay meadows, and evenings filled with the soft chorus of insects drifting upward from the valleys. Autumn clothed the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi in amber, russet, and muted gold, while harvest wagons once again crowded the familiar roads leading toward mills, markets, and river landings. Winter finally settled quietly across the county, softening every hillside beneath snow, while wood smoke rose steadily above warm farmhouses whose windows glowed against the early darkness. Each season brought its own occupations, yet none hurried the people beyond the natural rhythm established through generations. Orchard pruning in late winter quietly prepared the blossoms of spring. Planting yielded to cultivation, cultivation to harvest, and harvest to careful preservation against the colder months ahead. The rivers themselves reflected these changes. Spring floods occasionally reminded residents of the Mississippi's immense power, while calm autumn waters often mirrored entire forests with extraordinary clarity beneath still evening skies. Farmers, merchants, ministers, teachers, craftsmen, and riverboat crews all learned to measure time less by calendars than by these familiar cycles that repeated themselves with reassuring faithfulness year after year. As older generations gradually passed from the scene, younger hands quietly assumed familiar responsibilities. Sons inherited farms whose boundary fences had first been raised by their fathers and grandfathers. Daughters carried treasured household knowledge into newly established homes, where recipes, quilts, family Bibles, and carefully preserved letters continued connecting one generation with another. County deed books recorded the orderly transfer of property, while church registers quietly welcomed newborn children whose names would, in time, appear beside those of parents and grandparents already resting beneath shaded churchyard trees. Thus, history advanced without abrupt interruption. Each generation became both guardian and heir of the same enduring landscape. Family gatherings offered perhaps the clearest expression of this quiet continuity. During harvest celebrations, Christmas evenings, weddings, or simple Sunday dinners after church, several generations often shared the same table. Elders recalled the early years when wagon roads had been rougher, when certain villages had consisted of only a handful of buildings, or when the first railroad surveyors had appeared across familiar fields. Younger listeners absorbed these recollections naturally, not as distant history, but as living memory attached to recognizable hills, rivers, and orchards visible beyond the very windows beside which they sat. In such conversations, the county quietly remembered itself. The landscape itself preserved these memories with remarkable patience. Old wagon tracks gradually became grassy lanes bordered by mature hedgerows. Abandoned mill foundations remained beside clear streams, whose waters continued flowing as faithfully as before. Weathered limestone chimneys sometimes outlasted the homes they had once warmed, standing alone among fields where descendants still recognized the names of families long departed. Even ancient trees acquired familiar reputations within neighboring communities, remembered as landmarks beneath whose branches travelers had rested, sermons had been preached, or generations of children had gathered fallen apples each autumn. The passing years seldom announced themselves with dramatic change. Instead, they settled gently upon the county, much as evening light settled upon the limestone bluffs above the Mississippi. A sapling planted beside a farmhouse gradually matured into a broad shade tree beneath which 3 generations might later gather. A narrow footpath worn by countless daily journeys slowly became a well-established lane bordered by fences, wildflowers, and stone walls patiently assembled over decades. Every season added another quiet layer to the landscape until memory itself seemed woven into the very fields and forests. Contemporary county histories occasionally paused amid their accounts of elections, industries, and public improvements to describe these ordinary scenes. Their authors understood that the true measure of a county rested not only in statistics or commercial success, but in the familiar habits of its people. They noted orchards carefully tended year after year, schools whose attendance reflected thriving neighborhoods, churches whose registers faithfully preserved family histories, and villages whose merchants still recognized customers by name rather than account number. Such observations revealed a society whose greatest achievement had been quiet stability rather than restless change. Visitors arriving from larger cities often remarked upon the measured pace of daily life. They noticed that conversations seldom appeared hurried. Farmers paused beside roadside fences to exchange news without glancing anxiously toward the hour. Merchants welcomed customers with patient courtesy, discussing crops, river conditions, or family matters before turning to business. Even the movement of wagons through village streets reflected an absence of unnecessary haste. The county seemed content to allow each occupation the time it properly required, trusting that faithful work, completed carefully, possessed greater value than labor hurried toward completion. This peaceful rhythm extended even to the landscape surrounding the homes themselves. Kitchen gardens remained carefully weeded despite long days in the fields. Orchard branches received thoughtful pruning each winter. Split-rail fences were repaired before neglect invited greater labor later. Whitewashed church walls were renewed each spring. Schoolhouses received fresh firewood before the first frost, and bridges crossing the creeks were inspected after heavy rains. Such tasks attracted little public attention, yet together they expressed a deeply rooted belief that stewardship required constant care rather than occasional grand effort. Many families quietly preserved the story of the county without realizing they were becoming its historians. In attic chests rested carefully folded land deeds, whose ink had faded to a soft brown with passing decades. Nearby lay military discharge papers, marriage certificates, hymn books, recipe notebooks, and bundles of letters secured with simple ribbon. Each document described an ordinary life rather than a celebrated one, yet together they formed a record far richer than any monument. A grandson reading his grandfather's careful handwriting discovered not merely names and dates, but the familiar cadence of a voice that had once spoken beneath the same roof. Such humble papers often survived because succeeding generations recognized their quiet worth long before formal archives began collecting them. County cemeteries, likewise, became gentle libraries written in stone. Their weathered limestone monuments seldom boasted elaborate triumphs. More often, they recorded simple virtues: beloved wife, faithful husband, devoted mother, respected minister, trusted physician, or cherished child. Rows of cedar and maple trees cast shifting shadows across the inscriptions as seasons passed without interruption. From many of these quiet churchyards, one could still overlook the same valleys, rivers, and roads that had accompanied those lives from childhood until old age. The dead remained, in a sense, among the landscape they had helped cultivate, their memory continuing wherever orchards blossomed, church bells sounded, or paddlewheel steamers rounded familiar bends upon the Mississippi. Records preserved within the courthouse completed this quiet inheritance. Bound volumes containing deeds, probate inventories, tax rolls, marriage licenses, election returns, and township maps accumulated steadily upon sturdy wooden shelves. Clerks, whose careful penmanship seldom received public praise, patiently copied each transaction with remarkable precision, understanding that future generations might someday depend upon these pages to establish ownership, inheritance, or family connection. Few visitors regarded such ledgers with particular interest during their own lifetimes, yet they silently safeguarded the story of thousands of ordinary households whose names otherwise might have faded from memory altogether. Looking across the county during these closing years of the 19th century, one perceived a landscape that balanced permanence with gentle change. New brick homes occasionally stood beside weathered log houses preserved as barns or workshops. Railroad whistles echoed across valleys, where wagon wheels, still followed familiar roads. Telegraph wires accompanied fences behind which cattle grazed as peacefully as they always had. The broad Mississippi continued reflecting both paddle-wheel steamers and the evening sky with equal serenity, while the limestone bluffs watched over every passing generation with unchanging patience. The county had accepted progress, yet it had done so without abandoning the quieter virtues that had long defined its people. As another century quietly approached, many residents could scarcely have imagined how greatly the world beyond the county would soon change. Yet, within street, Louis County itself, the close of the 19th century, remained remarkably gentle. Evening still gathered first beneath the wooded valleys before climbing the limestone heights. Church bells continued marking the hours with familiar dignity. Smoke from countless hearths drifted upward through calm autumn air exactly as it had for generations, while the steady whistle of a passing riverboat carried across the Mississippi with a sound that belonged wholly to this place. Perhaps this quiet continuity explains why descendants searching today through faded photographs, family Bibles, census schedules, parish registers, and courthouse ledgers often recognize more than names alone. They discover a landscape that still speaks through its rivers, roads, orchards, churches, mills, and villages. The same limestone bluffs continue overlooking the broad Mississippi. Many ancient oaks still shade roads first traveled by wagons whose iron-rimmed wheels have long since fallen silent. Some churches preserve the very stones laid by 19th century craftsmen, while forgotten foundations resting beside woodland creeks quietly recall mills whose wheels once turned from dawn until dusk. Though buildings may disappear, the land itself remains an enduring witness. It is perhaps worth pausing, if only for a quiet moment, to consider the place from which you now listen. Every community, however distant, possesses its own forgotten roads, weathered records, quiet churchyards, and ordinary families whose faithful lives seldom entered celebrated histories. They, too, deserve remembrance. By preserving such local histories with patience and care, we honor not only remarkable events, but the countless peaceful days through which generations built homes, nurtured families, cultivated fields, and entrusted their hopes to those who followed. History has always belonged as much to ordinary neighbors as to celebrated names. Thus, the story of St. Louis County reveals itself not as a tale of sudden triumph or dramatic transformation, but as the patient accumulation of everyday life. Its riverboats carried more than freight. They carried correspondence, friendships, and opportunity. Its farms yielded more than harvests. They sustained families whose labor quietly shaped the landscape. Its schools educated more than children. They preserved knowledge for another generation. Its churches offered more than worship. They united communities through joy and sorrow alike. Its markets, mills, railroads, and courthouses formed only the visible framework surrounding a far deeper inheritance, the quiet character of a county whose greatest achievement was the peaceful continuity of ordinary lives lived with diligence, humility, and enduring hope. By the closing years of the 19th century, St. Louis County possessed an appearance shaped not by any single generation, but by the patient labor of many. The earliest French settlements had long since become part of an older memory, yet traces of that inheritance remain visible in ancient parish churches, enduring place names, and quiet farmsteads overlooking the Mississippi. American pioneers had added new roads, mills, schools, and villages, while German immigrants enriched the countryside with prosperous orchards, vineyards, carefully tended gardens, and solid brick farmhouses whose craftsmanship reflected both tradition and permanence. Riverboats still trace their familiar course beneath the limestone bluffs, even as railroad whistles echoed from the uplands. And together, these different eras blended so naturally that no sharp boundary separated one from another. Visitors approaching the county from the river often encountered a landscape that unfolded gradually rather than dramatically. Morning mist lingered over the broad Mississippi before sunlight revealed wooded bluffs rising above the water. Small landings appeared, where freight waited beneath rough timber warehouses. Church spires emerged beyond orchards already bright, with spring blossom or heavy with autumn fruit. Farmhouses stood comfortably among broad fields, enclosed by fences patiently repaired through many seasons. Every mile seemed to reveal another quiet evidence of long habitation, a stone bridge crossing a clear creek, an old mill beside a shaded stream, or a weathered lane disappearing between rows of ancient walnut trees. The county had become neither wholly rural nor wholly urban. Instead, it occupied a peaceful middle ground, where prosperous villages remained closely connected with surrounding farms, and where the great commercial energy of nearby street Louis enriched rather than overwhelmed the countryside. Farmers supplied grain, fruit, dairy products, livestock, timber, and stone to expanding markets, while returning wagons and rail cars brought books, machinery, tools, fabrics, and household goods that gradually improved everyday life without disturbing its familiar rhythm. Commerce and agriculture advanced together, each strengthening the other through quiet cooperation rather than rivalry. Throughout the county, the sounds of ordinary labor still defined each passing day more completely than any grand public event. Before sunrise, roosters greeted the coming light from scattered farmyards, while milk pails echoed softly within dairy barns. Axes rang through woodland clearings, where winter timber continued to be prepared for future building. Blacksmiths rekindled their forges before merchants swept their wooden porches, and school bells soon welcomed another generation of children carrying slates beneath their arms. Along the river, deckhands secured mooring lines while warehouse doors swung open to receive another cargo. Every occupation contributed quietly to the larger harmony of county life, each depending upon the faithful labor of the others just as surely as the river depended upon its countless tributary streams. The closing decades of the century also witnessed a quiet confidence in the county's future. Schoolhouses stood better equipped than those of earlier generations, their shelves holding atlases, readers, arithmetic texts, and histories whose pages had passed through countless careful hands. Churches maintained charitable societies that assisted widows, orphans, and families facing unexpected hardship. Agricultural associations encouraged improved methods of cultivation, while county fairs displayed prize livestock, carefully selected seed corn, orchard fruit, handmade quilts, woodworking, and fine craftsmanship that reflected the skill of ordinary households. These improvements emerged gradually, almost unnoticed from year to year, yet together they revealed a community continually refining itself without abandoning the values inherited from its earliest settlers. Nature remained the county's most faithful companion through every season of progress. Spring returned each year with astonishing certainty, covering orchards in delicate blossoms whose fragrance drifted across the valleys toward the Mississippi. Summer sunlight ripened wheat until entire hillsides shimmered like burnished gold beneath gentle breezes. Autumn gathered the harvest, while forests upon the limestone bluffs assumed rich shades of amber and russet, mirrored perfectly in the broad river below. Winter quieted every familiar road beneath frost and occasional snowfall, softening fences, rooftops, and churchyards until the entire countryside rested beneath an atmosphere of remarkable peace. However greatly transportation, commerce, or architecture evolved, these enduring rhythms continued reminding every resident that the land itself remained the county's oldest and most constant guardian. Evening perhaps revealed St. Louis County at its most tranquil. The final wagons returned from market along winding roads bordered by stone fences and mature oaks. Smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys where evening meals welcomed families home after long days of labor. Church bells marked the closing hour, while distant paddlewheel steamers sounded their measured whistles upon the Mississippi, answered occasionally by the softer call of a locomotive somewhere beyond the western ridges. Lanterns gradually appeared within village windows, until scattered points of warm light rested gently across the landscape, like quiet stars descended among the valleys. Above them all stretched the vast Missouri sky, unchanged since long before the first settlement had appeared along these rivers. Looking back across the entire century, one perceived that no single invention, building, or public event had defined the county. Its true identity rested instead upon the countless ordinary acts repeated faithfully from one generation to another. Fields were planted because families depended upon them. Mills turned because grain required grinding. Churches gathered because neighbors desired fellowship. Schools opened because children deserved learning. Riverboats continued their journeys because communities remained connected through commerce and correspondence. Every quiet task supported another, until together they formed a remarkably resilient society whose strength lay not in spectacle but in patient continuity. The century closed without ceremony. No single sunset announced that an era had reached its conclusion, nor did the people of St. Louis County awaken one morning believing they had entered a different age. Life continued much as it always had. Before daylight, farmers still stepped quietly into cool barnyards where lanterns cast long shadows across worn plank floors. Millers listened for the familiar rush of water against the wheel. Shopkeepers swept yesterday's dust from wooden sidewalks. School children hurried along lanes bordered by stone fences, while somewhere beyond the limestone bluffs the whistle of an approaching riverboat floated gently across the broad Mississippi. The county had never measured itself by dramatic moments. It measured itself by faithful repetition. What endured most completely was not the architecture alone, nor the prosperity recorded within tax ledgers or census schedules, but a shared understanding between neighbors. A fence repaired after a winter storm, a harvest completed before threatening rain, a meal quietly carried to an ailing household, or a teacher remaining after lessons to help a struggling pupil. Such actions seldom appeared in official histories, yet together they formed the unseen foundation upon which every church, courthouse, schoolhouse, and marketplace securely rested. Records preserved their names, but daily kindness preserved their communities. To later generations searching parish registers, probate inventories, land patents, cemetery inscriptions, or faded photographs, these quiet lives sometimes appear almost invisible beside the larger events of American history. Yet the county itself offers another testimony. The winding course of the Mississippi remains unchanged. Limestone bluffs continue overlooking the valley with the same quiet dignity that greeted French voyageurs, pioneer settlers, German orchardists, river pilots, teachers, blacksmiths, merchants, and farmers alike. Ancient oaks still shade roads that once echoed beneath iron-rimmed wagon wheels. Springs continue flowing from the same rocky hillsides where travelers once paused to water their horses before continuing toward the river. The landscape has remembered what paper alone could never entirely preserve. Perhaps that has always been the greatest gift offered by counties such as this. They remind us that history was not built solely within state capitals, battlefields, or halls of government. It was shaped every ordinary morning by families rising before sunrise, tending fields, opening shops, ringing church bells, teaching children, repairing tools, recording deeds, guiding riverboats, and returning home beneath evening skies that seemed almost unchanged from one generation to the next. Their names may appear only briefly within surviving records, yet their labor still lives quietly within the roads they built, the orchards they planted, the churches they raised, and the communities they entrusted to those who came after them. The enduring strength of St. Louis County could never be measured merely by the number of its farms, the tonnage carried upon its riverboats, or the miles of railroad completed before the century's end. Those achievements certainly mattered, and contemporary county histories recorded them with understandable pride. Yet beneath every statistic rested something quieter and more enduring. It was found in the confidence with which neighbors greeted one another upon village streets, in the familiar sound of church bells drifting across orchard-covered hills, in the patient rhythm of the mill wheel turning beside a limestone creek, and in the steady procession of wagons following roads whose curves had been shaped as much by the land itself as by human intention. The county possessed prosperity, but it had gained that prosperity without sacrificing the calm character that distinguished it from so many places transformed by restless expansion. Perhaps nowhere was this spirit more clearly revealed than upon an autumn evening beside the Mississippi. As daylight slowly faded beyond the western horizon, the river gathered every color of the sky into its broad current. Paddle-wheel steamers, their lanterns beginning to glow against the approaching dusk, continued their measured journeys toward distant ports. Along the bluffs, mature forests stood in quiet silhouette, while scattered farmhouses welcomed returning families with warm lamplight visible through small paned windows. Somewhere beyond the ridges, a locomotive announced its passing with a gentle whistle before disappearing once again into the gathering darkness. None of these sounds disturbed the evening. Together, they formed the peaceful music of a county whose waterways, roads, railways, churches, markets, schools, and homes had learned to exist in lasting harmony. If a traveler had lingered there until the first stars appeared above the valley, he might have understood why generations chose to remain upon this landscape. The rivers offered opportunity, yet never overshadowed the farms that depended upon them. The fertile fields rewarded careful labor without demanding haste. Limestone bluffs sheltered quiet communities whose churches, schoolhouses, and village squares reflected the patient work of many decades. Even the changing seasons seemed less like interruptions than familiar chapters returning faithfully each year. Such places invited not excitement, but belonging. They rewarded those willing to observe slowly, to remember carefully, and to recognize that history often advanced most profoundly through ordinary lives lived with constancy and quiet purpose. Thus, as the 19th century drew peacefully toward its close street, Levee County remained what it had gradually become across generations. A landscape where the Mississippi carried commerce without diminishing tranquility, where the railroad welcomed the future without erasing the past, where orchards blossomed beside ancient roads, and where every church bell, mill wheel, ferry crossing, market square, and farmhouse contributed another gentle note to the county's enduring story. It was a place whose greatest legacy was not found in extraordinary events alone, but in the steadfast rhythm of everyday life, a rhythm still faintly echoed wherever the river touches the limestone shore, and the evening light settles softly across the old Missouri countryside. Morning continued to arrive over St. Louis County, much as it always had. Before the first warmth of sunlight reached the limestone bluffs, pale mist gathered above the Mississippi and drifted slowly through the lower valleys. The broad river reflected the awakening sky with remarkable stillness, disturbed only by the measured passage of a paddle-wheel steamer beginning another day's journey. Along distant ridgelines, orchards caught the earliest light upon their branches, while scattered farmhouses emerged gradually from the cool shadows of dawn. No trumpet announced the beginning of another day. The county required no such ceremony. Its quiet confidence rested upon rhythms older than memory itself. For the farmer stepping into dew-covered fields, the teacher unlocking the schoolhouse door, the minister arranging worn hymn books upon polished pews, the blacksmith stirring yesterday's embers into fresh flame, and the river pilot watching morning fog lift from the channel. The new century promised only another opportunity to continue honest work. That expectation, modest though it seemed, had sustained generations. Great cities might measure progress through towers, factories, and crowded streets. Yet here, prosperity remained inseparable from fertile soil, dependable rivers, faithful neighbors, and the patient stewardship of land entrusted from one generation to the next. The county's true inheritance, therefore, survived not only within official records, but within the landscape itself. The limestone beneath every bluff remembered ancient seas long before the first settlement appeared. The Mississippi preserved the reflections of French voyageurs, pioneer flatboats, elegant packet steamers, and countless humble ferries that quietly connected opposite shores. The orchards continued bearing fruit where careful hands had first planted them decades earlier. Roads still followed ridges and valleys selected by practical wisdom rather than convenience alone. Even the weathered stones of forgotten foundations testified that ordinary homes had once stood where only meadow grass now moved gently beneath the wind. As decades quietly passed beyond the 19th century, many familiar sights gradually disappeared. Countless riverboats completed their final voyages. Old mills eventually fell silent as newer industries emerged elsewhere. Wagon roads yielded to improved highways, and some village stores closed after serving their communities faithfully for generations. Yet loss was never complete. Ancient churches continued welcoming worshippers beneath familiar bell towers. Courthouse ledgers remained carefully preserved upon sturdy shelves. Mature oak trees still shaded roads whose earliest travelers had arrived by horseback. The Mississippi flowed onward with unchanged dignity, carrying each new generation past the same limestone bluffs that had watched over every previous one. The landscape remembered, even when people forgot. History, when observed patiently, often resembles the river itself. It does not move in sudden leaps, but through a continuous current composed of innumerable small moments. Every conversation beneath a village porch, every harvest gathered before autumn rain, every school lesson patiently taught, every hymn softly sung within a country church, every careful signature entered into a courthouse ledger, all joined together until they became the quiet history of a people. Rarely did those who lived these moments imagine they were preserving anything remarkable. Yet it is precisely such ordinary days that later generations search for when tracing the footsteps of their ancestors. Perhaps somewhere among these valleys, one family still keeps an old Bible whose pages record births written in careful 19th century script. Perhaps an attic still shelters faded letters carried upriver aboard a packet steamer. Perhaps a weathered photograph continues resting inside a forgotten album, showing a farmhouse, orchard, or church whose surroundings remain recognizable even today. Such humble treasures remind us that history survives not only within museums and libraries, but within households that quietly preserve memory across generations. The quiet places of St. Louis County asked for very little from those who paused within them. They did not seek admiration through grand monuments. or celebrated spectacles. Instead, they offered something gentler, the reassuring knowledge that countless ordinary lives had unfolded here with dignity, patience, and purpose. Every weathered fence post, every shaded churchyard, every mill race winding beside a limestone creek, and every orchard overlooking the Mississippi carried traces of hands that labored faithfully without expectation that history would remember them individually. Together, however, they created a county whose character endured long after individual names had faded from daily memory. Even now, if one were to imagine standing upon the bluffs as evening descended over the great river, little effort would be required to let the 19th century quietly return. The broad Mississippi would still gather the final light of the setting sun upon its slow-moving surface. A paddle-wheel steamer, its lanterns glowing softly against the approaching dusk, would send a gentle whistle echoing through the valley. Church bells would answer from distant villages nestled among orchards and wooded hills. Smoke would rise peacefully from farmhouse chimneys, while horses, unhurried after a day's labor, followed familiar lanes toward waiting barns. Above them all, the first evening stars would appear over Missouri's wide sky, exactly as they had for generations whose stories now rested quietly within family records, parish books, courthouse ledgers, and the enduring landscape itself. Perhaps that is why counties such as this continue to hold such quiet importance. They remind us that the nation was not built solely through famous speeches, celebrated leaders, or dramatic events, but through the steady constancy of ordinary communities. Here, teachers patiently shaped young minds. Farmers trusted the seasons. Millers depended upon flowing water. Merchants honored their word with a simple handshake. Ministers comforted the sorrowful and blessed the joyful. River pilots guided their vessels through familiar channels, while mothers and fathers quietly prepared another generation to inherit the same roads, rivers, churches, orchards, and fields. These lives rarely sought recognition, yet together they formed the true foundation upon which larger histories were built. As we gently close these pages, the county seems less like a place left behind than one quietly waiting to be remembered again. Its limestone bluffs still overlook the Mississippi with patient dignity. Its ancient roads continue tracing the contours first chosen by practical wisdom. The echoes of mill wheels, church bells, market conversations, school lessons, and paddle-wheel whistles have long since faded into silence, yet they remain woven into the memory of the land itself. For those willing to listen with patience, Louis County still speaks not loudly, but with the calm voice of generations who understood that the greatest permanence is often found within the quiet rhythms of everyday life. And if, someday, a descendant should walk these same riverbanks, pause beside an old church, discover a familiar surname within a faded register, or recognize an ancestral farmhouse upon a forgotten photograph, the county will have fulfilled its quiet purpose. It will have carried memory safely across time. The rivers will still flow, the limestone will still endure, and the landscape will continue offering silent testimony that ordinary lives, faithfully lived, are never truly lost. They remain wherever fields are carefully tended, wherever bells continue to ring across peaceful valleys, and wherever history is preserved not merely in books, but in the enduring relationship between people and the places they called home. And thus, we close the entry for St. Louis County, Missouri. The paddlewheel steamers have disappeared beyond the bend of the Mississippi. The church bells have offered their final evening greeting. Lanterns glow softly in farmhouse windows, and the quiet roads rest beneath the shelter of ancient oaks. Yet the county itself remains, preserving within its rivers, limestone bluffs, orchards, villages, and peaceful fields, the memory of countless ordinary lives whose quiet labor shaped a lasting inheritance. May their story continue wherever history is cherished with patience, humility, and gratitude. Rest well.